Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. Hello, everyone. It's another solo podcast. Today I am sitting in my office, as you can see, using the very fancy Apple Studio filter so that you can barely kind of make out what's happening in the background unless I kind of back up towards it. You could start to see my books and things like that, but obviously my really cool art from all of the amazing artists that I had the pleasure of collaborating with, like Jim Lee and Stan Sakai, as well as so many others that are in the Asian American history book. If you haven't gotten a copy of that, please pick that up. I'm really proud of it, but also it just shares so much about Asian American history, especially here in Florida, that a lot of people don't know about. And it's fun for not just kids, but adults too. So quick plug on that. But today I am going to be talking about frustration, but specifically frustration in training. And I'm sitting at my desk because I do have notes today, and I had something that I actually wanted to read. So forgive me in my notes, and it's not going to make for a very exciting YouTube video, but audio people, you don't have to look at me anyway. So lucky you. My friend, I'm so happy I get to say friend, Coach Dan John, has a very awesome newsletter called The Wandering Weights. And for those of you who subscribe to my podcast, hint, hint, if you don't, please do, you'll hear Dan and I discuss T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone about quarterly. So we've been kind of going down and breaking the storyline and themes of it and how it pertains to modern life today, but also just kind of the impression this book has had on us. I am a huge fan of Merlin and all things of that nature. And when I found out that he was an aficionado, like just an expert in this book, I was so excited to go on this journey with him. So I'm really grateful that he is my friend and we get to have such wonderful conversations, in-depth conversations. But he has this really wonderful Wandering Weights newsletter, a little alliteration for you there. And just, he's so genteel and the sweetest man, but his Wandering Weights for a long time actually did break down the T.H. White Sword in the Stone, and kind of he retyped it and also gave his thoughts on all of that. So this is, our podcast is a little bit of a vocalization of those notes for those of you that already know Coach Dan John, because so many people already do. But for those that don't, he also, of course, is a world-renowned strength coach and has just so many accomplishments, has coached so many amazing athletes. And recently, my husband, not recently, honestly, this has been in my inbox for like over a year at least. And I've left it there because I was like, I'm going to talk about this one day. We're going to podcast about it, or we're going to go over it. And he forwarded me one of the posts that on weight training and coaching in general. And as a martial artist, there's so much overlap. For those of you tuned in, our last one was on how tic-tac-toe is a really great game for coaches. Applies to all types of coaches, whether it's fitness, whether it's martial arts, whether it's, in something strategic like chess. There's like just coaching in general. And so this is a passage from his newsletter. And of course, I'm going to be reading it. So this is Coach Dan John. One of the hardest issues to deal with in the weight room is frustration. My old boss once warned me the most spoiled generation in history had kids. Good luck. I had been complaining that parents kept telling me how hard their kids worked, but frankly, I couldn't see it. Sure, they drank sports drinks and energy drinks. Yes, they wore very expensive gear and had all the newest ways to taunt opponents and bring attention to themselves. But they didn't really understand hard work. After doing the Olympic lifts for a session or two, they still hadn't mastered it. The parents told me, kids are frustrated. It reminded me of a story. Of course, it reminded me of a story. Gary Player is one of the most successful golfers in history. One day, the game had got the better of him and he stormed off the course. A fan yelled out, "I would give anything for one of your bad days." The story goes on that player stopped and told the fan, no, no, you wouldn't. Later, he explained that he hears these kinds of things all the time, yet he doesn't see that fan out at the driving range as the sun comes up. The fan has never swung so many times that his hands have had bled into the gloves, and this fan doesn't understand the key to life, living, and performance. You are not good enough to be frustrated. If you spend 17 years mastering your craft, you might be allowed to tell us you are frustrated. If you spent 17 minutes, please pipe down and try again. You are not good enough to be frustrated. Showing up to practice barely on time with the rest of the team is just fine. Showing up early and practicing your craft alone is better. Finding time in the off season to master the fundamentals is far better than standing in a long line for your turn during the season. If I come into practice and watch you struggling to learn your craft and master your movements, then let us find a new way, a better way. If this doesn't work, we will keep trying new methods and ideas until we run out of time and energy. Then we will get back up and try again. We are not going to invite frustration to these sessions. I just don't think we are good enough. And that's the end of the part of the newsletter. I should probably just end it there, and Dan does such a concise job of writing succinctly and making it very clear. But since this is my podcast, I guess I'm just going to keep rambling a little bit longer for you on this subject, especially as it pertains to martial arts. He used some key words in there like hard work, which of course it's Kung Fu. He used key words like 17 years versus 17 minutes. I have so many students who have been with me for like 10 or 15 years that tell me, actually, I still feel like a beginner. And, I've been doing this over 40 years, and I can tell you that sometimes I still feel like a beginner. The frustration for martial artists often comes in that they don't feel like they're quote unquote progressing fast enough. And this is why this newsletter spoke to me so boldly. It just really jumped out at us, and Oscar forwarded it to me right away for obvious reasons, because we hear this all the time. I'm frustrated, I'm not learning fast enough, all of these things. And many of our students at the temple, like, we love them all. We love all of our students. We love the fact that they come, that they join a traditional Kung Fu school in 2024, that this is something that people still want to do. So we are grateful. But the frustration on our end comes when they expect immediate results. And I understand why. We're in an American culture. We have immediate satisfaction in the world. It's just like, we go in through the drive-thru, we expect our food hot, perfect, ready to go. We go into a store or we order on Amazon now, we expect our stuff here next day at least, or, same day delivery. And heaven forbid, we wait like a week now for anything, right? So we're just in a world where patience and waiting is not really as tolerated or as common. And so for us at the temple at Wa Lam, after 10 years of training, you can actually still be considered a beginner. And if you think about in the span of a beginner of 10 years, and I know that's not really true, you're not an actual beginner, but say we do a little calculation, and you all know I'm not a math person, but if you think about how many hours a week in 10 years does a student really train, right? Like, we have students that have been with us 10 years that are completely different levels because of the numbers of hours they put in per week, in and out of the classroom, right? Because just practicing your 1 or 2 hours a week versus someone who trains 5 times a week, but also does, cross training and more practice at home, that's just gonna basically, quadruple the progress, right? And this scenario that I'm going to lay out for you happens at least once a year. We'll call them student red and blue, or green and purple, or however you want to put it. But let's just say red and blue, right? So student red and blue start the same day. And after 5 years, student blue is light years past the student who in student red in curriculum. And they're like, hey, student red's like, I'm upset. I'm frustrated. And sometimes it's not even just their frustration. It's also that they get down on themselves. They say, I suck, I'm not good, et cetera, et cetera. Or we've often even heard things like, the teaching's unfair, that person gets to learn faster, I'm being held back. So there's a lot of narrative. And there's always a very specific line of questioning that I like to ask. And I ask the student, how many times do you come to class? How many extra hours do you practice at home? How many private lessons have you taken? What other activities do you do that complements your training? Do you have work or other activities that keep you from training? What distractions do you have in your life? And then lastly, do you know what the entire regimen and training schedule of the student you're comparing yourself to, student blue over there? So it's like, why are you comparing yourself? And I know it's really, really common to do, right? It's really easy to say, hey, I started the same day as XYZ over here, and they're just now they're on, the double broadswords. I want to learn the double broadswords. Well, who doesn't? Double broadswords is super, super cool, obviously, not just one sword, but two, right? But the thing is, we usually don't take that moment to think about what we are doing as students. And I'm just as guilty. Like if something's not happening fast enough, I get very impatient. But if you think about a typical American student that comes into our school, how many train 7 days a week and 3 extra hours on their own? Not too many. Even the ones that are die hard don't really do that. We all have lives, right? And so going above and beyond is rare. And they do deserve, right, to learn more and to progress faster because they're putting in the work. But it's just that it's a very small percentage. However, they're the ones that usually stand out at the school. People see that and think like that's the norm. Really, they're the outliers, right? There's also a circumstance. Some people have all this extra time that they're able to come for, earlier hours before class and train on their own, or they have a really easy schedule and they can practice on their own. Like, we just don't know everyone's circumstance in life. So it's really difficult when we compare ourselves to others. And also, it's really frustrating. I know I'm not supposed to be frustrated, right? Where this whole conversation is on you're not good enough to be frustrated, and I certainly feel that way. But the frustration from the teaching side comes from the fact that I'm going to say it and people aren't going to like it, but students are entitled. They think that because they pay tuition to come to class, or they showed up and they are who they are, that they are entitled to learn more, or they are entitled to being better at what they're doing, right? They just think they're entitled to this art form, which honestly is a privilege, right? I feel privileged to be able to teach it, to be able to carry on the legacy. I feel very privileged that I've been entrusted and empowered to do so, and students in return should feel grateful and respectful and learn that patience and control and that Foji Dojun for us Wallin practitioners, right? And so it's like that sense of entitlement honestly creates a barrier to learning. So if you start to feel that you deserve something, take a moment to think about why that is, or if that's really true. So for me personally, if I'm getting frustrated, I really want to take that deep breath and that step back. That's my process. I don't know what, works for everyone else. And I don't want to come across like I'm lecturing, but I know that when students are frustrated because someone else is learning faster, or I didn't get first place in the tournament, or I want to learn the whip chain and now I'm never going to get to learn the whip chain because you just told me it's going to take maybe 20 years. Just remember, thank you, Dan John, you are not good enough to be frustrated. I think it's a really great phrasing and way for us to kind of think about what should we be doing? What could we be doing more? And through that hard work and through those processes, we start to really discover ourselves. I mean, it may seem a little harsh, but this is also traditional Kung Fu, right? This is not the environment where we expect you to show up and everyone gets a trophy and everyone wins first place and everybody is lauded for just showing up. Like, showing up isn't going to get you to the level that maybe you're striving for, or that you are seeing as, being frustrated. And so again, I hate to be all like down on people here, but it's just that sense of entitlement that's very frustrating for us traditional Kung Fu Sifus, because that was not how we were raised, right? And so the culture of traditional Chinese martial arts very much comes from a trusting system. So it also feels like a lack of trust in your teachers when you get frustrated. It means that you don't trust that we know where you should be, what you're doing. And I'm not saying people don't slip through the cracks and that we also as teachers make mistakes, but I think as a student myself, anytime I've been frustrated, it only took me a minute to go, wait a minute. I'm also not good enough to be frustrated. There's definitely a lot of questions you can start to ask yourself as to why. Why haven't I done this? I mean, I can just tell you right now, I'm frustrated. Boo-hoo me. I'm frustrated. My right hip's a little bit tweaky, and it's been tweaky for a while for a multitude of reasons, 40 fit foo, all the stuff. But honestly, I can't be frustrated because I know I'm not doing everything in my power on a daily basis to fix it. Am I doing all of the prehab rehab work? Am I doing all of the things I should be doing on it? Like, am I spending all day kind of making sure I'm tending to that? Am I getting out of the chair more often, as often as I should? No, I'm choosing other priorities. Regardless of how valid those priorities are, family, work, mental health, I still choose those things over my hip exercises. And so I can't be frustrated when I'm not the one doing the work. We ask all of our coaches to read Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And it may not speak to everyone because there's a very military tone, and the examples given are, live action from the war and different examples. But the principle is just so on point, which is just take accountability for our own actions. Like, own it. Own if something is frustrating you, like, yes, there's outside factors, right? But at the same time, like, we can own our own actions. And I think that's something that I have to constantly remind myself to do. It's not easy, and it's really difficult, right? I often get the question, was Kung Fu training harder, quote unquote, back in the day? And I'm like, well, back when? In the 80s when I trained, in the 90s when I trained? Or are you talking about the 50s and 60s where, my father was kind of coming up into his own as a martial artist? Or are you talking about ancient China where soldiers were training in, and where old school, like, Kung Fu masters were training in the villages and stuff? Like, what does back then mean, right? But even if we just look back, say 20 years ago, just think about all the changes we've had, right? The smartphones have changed the face of the world, and that this next wave of AI, that's going to be the world's changing, right? So were things harder or were they easier? If you ask my parents' generation, right? And I think everyone's heard the story about walking uphill both ways to school, or if you ask a teenage student like how hard they have it versus their parents, they'll say, well, you don't get cyberbullied, and you don't have the social media distractions. You don't have all of these different technological and socio situations that life was simpler maybe when we were, in your day, kind of thing. So every generation, I think, has their own challenges, and every person, every individual has to handle those in their own way. So we can't really say if something was harder. Like, yes, some things were harder, right? Because we weren't allowed to take water breaks, or we weren't allowed to do certain things, or there was a more strict level and regimented of training. But at the same time, things can be perceived as a little bit harder now because the communication has changed and the way of the students. So really, I think no matter what, it comes down to, as a martial artist, if you show up and do the work hard, do the repetition, like, that practice, that perfect practice is essential. Like, the philosophy at Walam and in Chinese martial arts, I think it's just like, you want to better yourself, you want to be a better person. I just did a podcast on that, but really it's up to the coach or Sifu to guide students to get the results. And because students have changed, we have to change the way we teach in a sense too, right? So when we get lazy or entitled students in traditional Kung Fu, that can be frustrating, but it's our job as Sifus, as teachers, to guide them and instill the mindset needed to succeed. So while Training was simpler back in the day, quote unquote, because we just worked hard, we showed up, things were more regimented. It was a little bit more like show up and do what you got to do. Whereas now, students that come in, they're a little more distracted. There's a lot of outside factors. There's so much more intake of information that makes you susceptible to stress and anxiety because you know the world is on fire and there's all this stuff going on, because we know climate change is happening and it's causing all of this stress for the future. Whereas back in the day, unless you read the newspaper or maybe tuned into the news exactly at the time when it came on, you weren't as aware, right? And so for us, we have to kind of know as teachers, how do we adjust to this type of student, right? And so this type of student that has all of these distractions and all of these stressors in life, like, we have to find a way to get them to where they need to be. But our frustration and our disappointment comes when students come in and they aren't willing to learn the philosophy. They aren't willing to make those adjustments and to kind of come in with an open heart and empty cup, right? Like Master Chan always says, like, you have to empty your cup. And I know it's not just his saying. A lot of people say, if you can't learn if your cup is full, kind of thing. And he always says, like, if you eat too much, then you're just gonna throw everything up. And I think that's a lot more graphic, but it works, right? And so, for example, right now we're currently in tournament training. So our Kung Fu calendar, our Wallam calendar, goes as follows. In the beginning of the year, it's Chinese New Year. So January, February, even into March now, we have shows, we're performing. And then once that wraps, we go into tournament training, because over the summer, there's a lot of tournaments that students participate in. But right after that ends, we start preparing for fall shows. So there's a lot of performances here at the temple. And then also it starts to seg into us preparing for Chinese New Year. Like, I already just sent out the schedule for Chinese New Year next year of like, when's the date? We already have some show requests and it's April, right? But it just, the years go really, really fast. So it's like rinse and repeat. Chinese New Year, tournament training, show prep training, other stuff in between, prepare for Chinese New Year, and then we're back into the cycle. So it's an interesting dynamic to always have something going on. And this is what I was talking about with distraction. Like, we are so distracted. Even within our Kung Fu training, we're distracted. Like, we have some students that are like, I want to be a better drummer. Well, yeah, we do the drumming, but then if, like, we've got a tournament coming up, you're focused on that. You're not practicing your music skills, and vice versa. Like, some students are working on their skills. They don't get to be a good lion dancer because there's so much going on. So it can be very difficult and challenging, but I think this is where we need to remember we're not good enough to be frustrated, because we have to think about, well, sometimes we're not going to be able to do all the things. We have to kind of pick and choose. The beauty of a traditional art like Kung Fu is that the content itself doesn't really change, right? Like, our Kung Fu style has been consistently taught generation through generation with some small variances, but ultimately at the core of it, it's different. At the core of it, it's the same, but what changes is the nature of the students. And so we then update our level of teaching, right? And so we're trying to combat the YouTube generation and TikTok generation of kids who are distracted. But then at the same time, I'm like, I don't know, Oscar used to say he stayed up at night reading comic books and staying up. And, we also had like people back in the day who just went clubbing all night or whatever the case may be. And so it's like, is it really that different? Like, or just the distractions different, right? So, but I do think the information we take in has definitely changed. Like, I kind of call it the buffet of information that's available. And what we hope at Wallam is that we will push forth all of the good stuff first. So as it pertains to martial arts, there's so many videos and tutorials and schools, to be honest, that are misleading. So if you go to a buffet where the first thing you see are Cheetos, ice cream, pizza, chicken nuggets, and French fries, yeah, talk about a junk food day, right? No judgment here, because I crave that stuff as much as the next person, and there's no judgment, but there's really no substance, right? Like, there's no lean protein and veggies. But what if those were like hidden at the back of the buffet in a secret room that's not accessible, and you just eat what you see first, right? Especially if it's appealing to you, right? So after eating all that, though, you're not really satiated. You end up maybe even sick. So there's a buffet of kung fu options as it pertains to the YouTube media and schools that just throw themselves out there in their slick marketing, but maybe there's no substance. And I don't mean this to be demeaning, but I would say it's important to, think about finding those quality instructors that really care about the well-being of the students and the style. And it doesn't even have to be traditional. This isn't just hey, it's traditional martial arts versus the newer martial arts that have come out, or hybrids or anything like that. I think it's just quality, right? And so finding quality can also be really difficult, in the same way as there's like the junk food buffet. There's a junk food buffet of kung fu out there. And so sometimes it's also what you're introduced to first. And what's sad is, like, to me, a lot of students don't know the difference. I've had conversations with other Sifus of other styles, and they're always frustrated when a student shows up and they're like, "Oh, I've been with my school for 10 years and, but they closed down and now I'm here, but I was like a black belt, triple purple stripe level." And then we see them perform, or we see the basics they've learned, and it's really, really, hate to use the word, frustrating, but it's really sad, actually, that people just make shit up and then they self-proclaim themselves masters and they trick these students. Like, I see so many students that just, unfortunately, they just don't know any better. And you wonder how it's possible that someone can just follow blindly. But at the same time, when you've got the junk food buffet with all this stuff being thrown at you, you just take to the first thing you see. And if you feel good doing it, maybe there's some benefit. But I tend to get very angry with situations where students who got greedy, disgraced their Sifu, moved on to self-proclaim themselves masters. This doesn't just happen in Wallam. It happens everywhere. And in particular, people who have trained with my father and have gone on to, slander our style or whatever, but this isn't really about them. But, like, just to give you an idea of the boldness and the type of character of humans that we're dealing with, it's, my father generously opened his doors to everyone because that was his goal. It's what he wanted to do. And there's a difference between how he is and how a lot of other kung fu masters are, and there's no right or wrong here, but he was also very open. He would always invite his master friends, like Praying Mantis Master Zhang Pingdao or Sword Master Yi Xingwei, many masters from around the world. He would invite them to teach the Wallam students because of their relationship, and a lot of them would never have done that if it weren't for the relationship with my father. So he was very open in allowing us, his own students, to learn from others, because he was never threatened by anyone, really. He was like, if they want to learn and they want to, so he wanted to also expose us to all of the best and allow us to have these small lessons, right? And so the part that really frustrates me, and to give you an idea of the type of characters I'm talking about at these junk food kung fu buffets, is that go on to open their own schools, is like, they will literally have taken just a 2-hour seminar with one of these masters. And I've seen this online. And they claim that they are now the descendants from that style, and that they have been given the responsibility to continue teaching what they learned from this master, because nobody knows better. They haven't done their research. They don't know that, this person never really learned from that master, or doesn't have lineage, or doesn't have actual like time with this person, that they really just learned it in a 2-hour seminar. And because they have a photo with him, they now proclaim, like, this was my master. And now that this person has died and can't defend themselves, they don't obtain permission to do so. They disregard any protocol, any oh man, my words are escaping me, but the respect, the order of respect that should be taken in order to kind of do something like that. So they just illicitly sell what they never rightfully owned in the first place. And those are the people that really frustrate me. And in a different way than I'm not good enough to be frustrated, because I think in this sense, this is where frustration has a place to be. But in the end, do I really have the right? Maybe what I should do instead is take that energy I give to frustration and instead use it to teach my students to be better, to pay it forward, to continuously help make better humans, which will hopefully make me a better human, and to just maybe even take that energy and work on my tweaky hip. I don't know. But I feel like frustration is something that we all combat. And I'm so curious how that works out for you. So there's a lot of better ways I feel for myself to use the little time on the earth I have than be frustrated. And so I'm going to try not to do that. And so if you'd like to share, though, what frustrates you and what you're going to do about it, I'd love to know. Please share. And that is my rant for the day. I still haven't come up with a catchy, rucka rant synonym. So I don't have one. If you have a clever way of telling me what you think a Sifu Mimi rant wording would sound like, a nice little catchphrase, let me know. But I would really actually like to hear what frustrates you, and then maybe come on, let me know what your plan is to do about it. I'm always willing to try to learn more. So thanks for listening, and have a great day. Be a little less frustrated. Bye.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram or Facebook.